Welcome everyone to the philosophy class. We are studying philosophy of law. We are on chapter 5 now, and we shall be progressing with that. Over to Craig.
Okay, so today we're going to keep going into the role of the judiciary versus legislative processes. One of the core aspects of modern political science, and also, really foundation of separation of powers. So we've covered this a number of times. The cornerstone of modern democracy is really based on the separation of powers. This builds upon a concept established by Montesquieu, a French philosopher, a writer and noble from several hundred years ago. But he captured sort of the heart of many of the aspects of the Roman Republic before it changed and became an empire. And it is, the points that are essential to creating a well-functioning democratic government. So in his work, The Spirit of Laws, Montesquieu argued that government power should be divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. Now, each branch then operates independently. It has specific powers, allowing it to operate under checks and balances. And in this way, none of them should be too strong. So this prevents the concentration of power, also safeguards the liberties of individuals. And in this, we'll explore the fundamental role of what the judiciary plays within this framework, its interaction with the legislature, and how these dynamics unfold into contemporary legal systems. And in this, I'll even try and explain how the analogies work with systems like Bitcoin or blockchain. It's not anarchist as people think, but rather what we have is the separation of powers. We have a competitive system where a variety of different nodes, which are miners, sort of commercial operators, fight to try and get as much money as they can to be profitable. And in this, if they collude, then we have that balanced by other things. We have the ability to take judicial action because, unlike home users, the nodes are seen. I mean, they can operate small. And if a node remains small, say 1 or 2%, then they can operate under the radar and no one need find who they are. But once they become large, 10, 20, sometimes 30% of the network hash power, then it's infeasible and impossible, in fact, for them to operate in a way that isn't easy to track. So the very nature of success makes these individuals more likely to be noticed and changes how the power dynamic works. So getting back to the other, Montesquieu's separation of powers, the philosophical underpinnings are a core aspect of modern democratic theory. And for those I've recommended before, the Federalist Papers, the American government was founded on these principles. It was really a concept of a modernized, revamped, republican system based on the Roman Republic. So if we start with Montesquieu's theory, in advocating for separation of powers, Montesquieu was reacting to the absolute monarchies of his time, where all government authority was concentrated in one ruler or entity. And this itself had been, radically changed. If we think back and if we look into our history and we go into the system in France or England, for instance, then England had mostly a weak monarchy. That got more powerful over time, but it never formed an absolute monarchy in the nature of France. But even France, it was weakened through most of its history up until around the 14th to 15th century. And with the Sun King, Louis XIV, etc., then the centralization of power allowed the king to grab all of the citizens in and for him to set policy, etc., which might seem good. It made a powerful state, but it also bankrupted it. It left it to a state where in a couple generations, the state then collapsed and revolution happened, leading to the violence in France. So If we want to go into this, the theory by Montesquieu argued for a government to reserve the liberty of citizens where power is dispersed among the various different branches. And the reason for doing this is that then they all stop each other. Anyone who tries to gang up on the others basically gets crushed by, well, the force of others. So it is balance. No, everyone's striving for power. The natural understanding of how humans work is part of this. Like capitalism, it is the very nature of understanding that people are imperfect that leads to this balanced system that allows us to develop and grow. So by dividing the functions of government, liberty is protected from tyranny. Montesquieu posited that if legislative, executive, and judicial powers are combined in one body, a person, a group, then that's where authoritarian rule starts. So we see this in other authoritarian governments now, when we see one choice of political rule, for instance, China, North Korea, etc. The centralization of government, the ability to crush opposition, happens because there's nothing to balance this. So others will argue that the strength of the government isn't there and the government can't do anything. But then what is the role of government? So Montesquieu's theory rests on the idea that each branch of government has a unique role. Legislature makes laws, executive implements and enforces laws, and the judiciary interprets them, ensuring that they're applied justly in accordance with constitutional principles, remembering the past and the future. So the constitutional principles here are, we have to remember the past, the people who came before us, those who built and founded society. The people who are dead still have a role in that. Well, for instance, if you leave a legacy, for instance, or if you build something and you want to create something that sets what you're trying to create, then why should that disappear just because you're no more? If you work your life to put aside money, then that should be set and protected. So the result of this is clear. If power is separated and distributed amongst a variety of different entities, no single person, branch, or anything else can dominate the system. This creates a balance of power, protecting individuals from the potential abuses of government. It's not perfect. No system is. So the separation doesn't mean complete isolation between branches. Montesquieu recognized the branches need to be independent. They should be able to check one another. They self-audit. So like nodes, even if we have 3 nodes in Bitcoin, they self-audit each other. They make sure each runs and maintains the system without exceeding or changing any of the rules. And in government, the theory by Montesquieu fosters a combination of independence and interdependence. It's neither one or the other. The various branches of government have a balanced equilibrium of power where all strive, well, basically not to lose theirs, but means they can never gain against the others. If one gets too powerful, the other two basically can take action against it. So if we now extend this to looking at the application of these different processes in modern governance, then we need to think about how this plays out in modern legal systems. And most democratic systems now have adopted some form of Montesquieu's separation of powers. Again, I said most democratic systems. While many nations, including North Korea, call themselves democratic, there is a big difference between calling yourself a democratic country and being a democratic country. And a democratic republic is one that balances powers so that we also balance demagoguery. We don't want just the people, the mob. We want to have a reasoned way of slowing things down. Change for change's sake can be a problem. So that's part of this. Now, the United States, it reflects a constitution that captures Montesquieu. Here, the legislative power is vested in Congress, the executive power in the president, and judicial power in the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, this is far from perfect. Anyone who looks at, reads the Wall Street Journal or the, well, Washington Post or the Atlantic or any of this other these other papers are going to very quickly and quickly see that we see abuses of this all the time now. The separation of powers is being eroded. Now, the Supreme Court are being activists in many cases. We see that especially when there are more left-leaning Supreme Court justices. And we also see the executive power being abused. While there are areas where the executive can effectively be a quasi-legislative branch, this is overstepped all the time. If we think about it for a moment, execution isn't the same as setting. So the Constitution really says that the legislative power should be in Congress. But how many of us have watched American politics, which we can't escape from, whether we want to or not, and seen the president putting through new bills? By its very nature, this is not meant to be the right, because the Congress passes laws, but the president in the US has the power to veto. So the president can issue executive orders, but the judiciary can review these actions and declare them unconstitutional if they violate the Constitution. The judiciary can also rule on the constitutionality of laws, a process known as judicial review. This was established really early on in a landmark US case of Marbury and Madison in 1803. So this goes right back to the start of the United States. Now, the UK, where I'm a citizen, is, well, a softer version of the separation of powers. The UK operates a parliamentary system, as in Australia, where I originally came from, and I'm still a citizen there as well. The UK operates a parliamentary system where the executive, which is Prime Minister and Cabinet, is drawn from the legislature. This creates an overlap. The executive and legislative branches are joint, but the judiciary it is independent. So the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, the UK Supreme Court was established, changing itself from the House of Lords. I'm old enough that I still call it the House of Lords, but it's actually the UK Supreme Court. And this formalized the judiciary's separation from the House of Lords, the other aspect, which was designed to enhance judicial independence. Conversely, France's Fifth Republic, Montesquieu's theory is enacted through the Constitution of 1958. The president and executive possess powers in this where they are counterbalanced by a bicameral parliament. Many forms of parliament are bicameral, which means two houses. And again, France has an independent judiciary represented by the Constitutional Council. These bodies ensure that new laws conform to French constitutional sort of structures and hopefully present, again, an imbalance of power. Germany, the I'm trying to say German, I'm terrible at it, so forgive me. Anyway, someone who, yeah, that one. For us, horrible trying to say, I could never do German very well. I always sound, well, like I'm trying to spit. The basic law here delineates the roles of federal parliament, the Bundestag, and the Chancellor, the executive. The Federal Constitutional Court ensures a clear division of powers again, and the Constitutional Court plays a role in maintaining checks and balances, looking at the constitutionality of laws and executive actions. So in a variety of different Western countries, we see this very clearly. Unfortunately, a lot of developing nations in the world, well, haven't got this, and power has been usurped by one or, well, even individuals or small factions, leading to many of the problems that we see. When we don't have that ability to, well, stop power, power can stop us. So going back into judicial review, we need to consider the power and limits The judiciary in Montesquieu's framework holds a significant role in judicial review. This is the power to determine the constitutionality of legislative and executive actions. That is a power that is crucial because it enables the judiciary to serve as a check on the other branches. So unfortunately, there's a lot less on the philosophical side of this and a lot of more general lecture idea, because to go into this, we need to understand the reasons why. So this is creating a system that, well, the laws and executive actions are said to comply with the Constitution. And the Constitution is generally the look back in time. So we think of our forefathers, the people who created the nation. They're the people who set the rules that we now apply. Doesn't mean they can't be changed, but it means a supermajority. It doesn't happen on the whims, and there's a dampening factor on change. So without that, change happens too quickly, and nothing will ever be solid and foundational. And if we have too much change, then, well, no one can actually do business even. So the judiciary in this is relegated to applying laws without the ability to guard against constitutional overreach unless they have this power. So judicial review sparks debates around the extent of the power, with many critics arguing that when courts strike down laws passed by the legislature or decisions made by the executive, they are in effect making new law. So this is where judicial overreach comes into it, where judges, unelected individuals, wield legislative-like powers. If we take another example from the US Supreme Court case that most people around the world would know, it's been again in the sort of news because of changes, the 73 case of Roe versus Wade. In this, the court recognized the constitutional right to privacy that extended to a woman's right to choose an abortion. The decision significantly altered the legal landscape in the United States. It raised questions about whether the court was determining law rather than simply interpreting it. And the decision sparked decades-long standing debates between those who argue that the court was protecting rights and those who felt that it had stepped into the realm of legislation. So getting back to this, the concept of judicial determination is one where courts create or significantly alter legal principles. It's a source of tension in modern democracies. A lot of people don't like it. It blurs the line between interpretation and legislation, challenging the principles of the separation of powers. However, it's important to note that judicial determination is necessary, especially where laws are outdated or ambiguous. In some instances, judicial determination is the only way to address societal issues that legislators have failed to resolve. One example has been civil rights. But again, it's a balance without going into overreach. So the appropriate role of the judiciary, philosophically, the judiciary is meant to act within its sphere, applying laws and reviewing actions, and not stepping into the role of creating policy. But we're all human, and judges are human. And any human will apply their own psychological ideas, concepts, beliefs, and practically there is a balance between interpretation and determination, and that needs to be managed very well. And some do better than others. So when judges respect rule of law, they maintain stability and predictability in the legal system. This ensures the evolving nature of society is done in a way that maintains, well, a low level of conflict and allows people to get on with business and actually, well, survive conflicts, a society that is just. So do we all remember what we discussed in the rule of law? To go back and jump into that.
Do you mean the three different methods that a judge has to interpret law?
No, I mean the rule of law generally. So when we think about our legal systems, we should be looking at enforcing the rule of law. The aspect of, well, what is the rule of law? What do you think when someone mentions the rule of law? What do you think of? No one?
Enacting law that the executive has confirmed.
It's more than that. So to go back and recap, rule of law is one of the fundamental principles of our modern democratic society and our legal system as a whole. So we're looking at the core where rule of law posits that individuals and institutions, including the government itself, are subject and accountable under the law. No one is, well, basically should be more equal than another. While you might have more money and it might be easier, your privilege, your equality under the law is the same. It is a safeguard against arbitrary governments. It ensures that laws, rather than the whims of leaders or the powerful, the entities govern society. So the key elements we discussed were the supremacy of law. No one, including a government official, is above the law. If you think back, the Sun King, Louis XIV, was the state. He said, I am the state. Well, he was above the law. But in rule of law, laws are supreme, and every person or institution, regardless of status or power, must comply. Equality before the law. All individuals are treated equally in the eyes of the law, whether rich or poor, powerful or powerless. Everyone is entitled to the same protections and responsibilities. That is critical. Accountability. Government officials and institutions, both of these, must act according to legal frameworks and are accountable. Now, by accountable, I mean they can be held accountable through legal process. This prevents the abuse of power and ensures that public actions are justifiable under the law. People then can learn to trust the law. Transparency, one of the core functional founding areas of Bitcoin. Legal processes must be clear, accessible, conducted openly, and allow the public to understand how laws are applied and ensure justice is visible and seen. An example of a failure here would be a Star Chamber. In England, the Star Chamber was a private court by the king. And the king could basically try someone and have them executed, imprisoned, etc., without any jury. So next, independent judiciary. For the rule of law to be effective, the judiciary must be independent and impartial. Courts need to have the authority to oversee and challenge the actions of other branches of government and ensure that laws are consistent and fairly applied. Legal certainty and stability. Laws must be known, predictable, and applied consistently over time. You can't change these things on a whim. It's not like some of the countries in like North Korea or Sierra Leone or something where there's no real law apart from what a few people at the top say, where it can change arbitrarily. So that leads to stability and legal certainty, and citizens and businesses, companies can rely on stability to plan actions, and they can take long-term investments and trust that the law protects their rights and property. Next, the last is the protection of fundamental rights, not just human rights. The rule of law ensures that legal systems protect fundamental rights and liberties. The court plays a critical role in upholding rights, preventing unjust laws or government actions, and not allowing people to have their individual freedom breached. So in practice, going back to what I asked, the rule of law is a bedrock for the democratic governance of our society, ensuring fairness, justice, and stability, and apple pie and all that other stuff. I'm not trying to make it sound silly, but it is. It's the foundation of what makes countries work. So without rule of law, we end up with a dysfunctional system. We see that in a lot of third world countries even now. So when the rule of law breaks down, societies become prone to arbitrary decision-making, corruption, and the concentration of unchecked power. So hopefully that summarizes the rule of law again, what we've covered. An important aspect of what we need to understand. So conflicts between the judiciary and other branches, despite Montesquieu, despite the framework he made, conflicts between the judiciary and the other branches will always happen. They're inevitable. Conflicts arise when the judiciary exercises its power of judicial review, or if the executive issues directives that challenge the boundaries of authority. So if we consider conflicts within the United States, we go back in history, back not quite 100 years, but we say to Franklin D. Roosevelt and the administration there, the Supreme Court struck down a number of pieces of legislation to do with the New Deal. The New Deal legislation was aimed at addressing what, well, Roosevelt thought would solve the Great Depression. Typical problems with economists and bad ideas, and government action trying to solve things that they can't. The president here was infuriated. He saw the court as obstructing necessary reforms, and he attempted to counteract this by proposing a court packing plan. He said he would expand the number of justices in the Supreme Court, allowing him to appoint judges that were more sympathetic to his policies. This is why the president alone shouldn't be allowed to just put in a judge that he wants. It needs to be reviewed. So the plan was never implemented, luckily. And the incident, however, demonstrates the tension that started to arise when the judiciary exercises powers in a manner that conflicts with legislative or executive goals. Another point to remember is old Roosevelt there is one of the only presidents, and now the only one, that didn't serve 2, but served 3 terms. And part of why presidents can only serve 2 terms now is Mr. Roosevelt, who, if he didn't die, would have gone for a 4th and 5th, and yeah, it would have been terrible. So next, let's look at some other nations. India is based on some of the ideas given to it from Britain. Many years in Britain taught democratic principles in a way that hasn't been, well, given across the world in other areas. So it's still not perfect. The division of India into Pakistan, East and West, etc., and all of the problems that were caused, it was a mess. But so if we go back to the judiciary and the executive, the political upheaval, say back to the 70s, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi faced off against the judiciary following the Supreme Court's landmark judgment in Keshan, again, I'm horrible, some of these things, Keshanavanda Bharati versus State of Kerala, 1973. Probably spell it better than I could say it, but anyway, established the basic structural doctrine limiting Parliament's ability to amend powers and the fundamental aspects of the Constitution. Gandhi attempted to curb the judiciary's powers by pushing for constitutional amendments and apportioning more pliant judges. This created a standoff. So none of this is perfect. And when I keep saying we need to remember over time, then we need to remember that people are going to keep trying to change these things. People are going to grab power. It's natural. It's part of the process. And us as humans need to watch and monitor. For the system to be successful, we can't be sheep. We can't be lazy. So the potential resolutions to conflict, well, not only include clearer constitutional provisions delineating the powers of each branch, the proper checks and balances and the dialogue and negotiation between the branches, as I've discussed, but education. And we need to have people educated and understand judicial restraint, where judges avoid overstepping their role by making policy decisions, which prevents unnecessary conflicts, and legislative prudence, ensuring that laws are drafted with clear language and intent. So this reduces ambiguity, prevents judicial misinterpretation, and the executive can moderate its power by respecting constitutional boundaries and ensuring executive orders don't bypass other branches, etc. But there's a core aspect of this that comes back to education. With what I've just said, who can tell me why I keep harping on education? Remember what I told you in Aristotle.
You need to. You said that education is about taking part in a society and not training or formation to a certain job. So
no, it's not professional skills. It's not doing an engineering degree, a law degree, it's more aligned with what we traditionally saw in liberal arts. So you're right. It's understanding and being part of society. Those fluffy, soft things that people run around going, these will never get me a job. No, they will help you be a better citizen. They will help you make a better, stronger society. And if you have a better, stronger society, one with the foundational aspects of society well, bounded by law, structured so that people understand virtue, and that we can have debate and argue with each other without getting into, well, slandering and lies, then that's where we have strong societies. And by strong society, I don't just mean military strength. I mean strong internal power, people who know how to run what they want to run, know how to set the goals of society, and then can overwatch and oversee what's happening in government and parliament. We elect people. It's our job for our representatives to be answerable. People sit there going, oh, my letter means nothing. Of course it does. How many people know where the Federalist Papers that I keep talking about came from? With pseudonymous authors, including Publicus and things like this, which were Madison and were the others. Where were they put? These letters weren't private. They were in newspapers. They were sent out as a political statement. They were published widely. The foundational concepts of what people learn in political science in the United States were letters to the editor. Think about that for a moment. The United States, the government was founded, moving it to the constitutional reform from the original, well, government structure that changed into the United States after the war. I mean, the original foundational documents weren't what we see now. That took years to develop. Not decades, but years. And for this to occur, people argued publicly. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have all of these instant ways of doing things. But they had a way of printing. They could send a letter off, and that could be put in a newspaper, and the country could read it. If we think about that for a moment, isn't that what we should be doing now? Not having a rant, not going on necessarily with trolling. What I'm saying is we should be thinking about the society we want to build, the society we want for our children, our wives, our family, our parents, our grandchildren. And if we sit there going, oh, well, I can't do anything, it's like full nodes in Bitcoin. If you sit there watching but having no way of signaling, what can you do? You can be like a full node and go, I don't like that. I'm going to protest by not voting. What does that get you? I mean, it's one thing to go into court and donkey vote so that people know that you actually voted, but you think they're all stupid. I mean, that's still not going to get you anywhere. It's another to vote for maybe a small candidate. But it's also part of not just waiting 3 or 4 years and being active in understanding the world we live in, being part of that society. That's what education's really about. So going back to the topic, the judiciary's role in democratic theory and practical sort of governance evolves. Judges are more and more called upon to adjudicate a wide variety of societal issues. This comes into climate change legislation. It comes into technology, privacy, but it shouldn't be their role. So as technology advances and societies become more complex, the judiciary's ability to interpret laws in light of new challenges is paramount, but it doesn't need to be difficult. one of the most interesting judges, interesting isn't a bad word, was Lord Denning. Lord Denning managed to find a way of bringing many different aspects of how the law worked into, well, back into grabbing it into common law. I've mentioned this one before. He would have been fine with the internet. He would have just treated it like other systems. The example I give many times is the equivalent of TCP now, which was a fax machine, etc. He looked at someone negotiating a contract over a river, say for a ferry. The person called out, they responded, they did things. And depending on those interactions, you can see whether a contract has been formed or not. You don't need to say, oh, the technology is so difficult, we need new laws. We don't. We need to have analogies that people understand. We need to break this down. So we need to be able to do this, to make it simple for people. In the case of Bitcoin, what are we doing? We have Bitcoin. It's both a very complex system and a simple system. Nodes, well, they build blocks. That's rather simple. There's a few of them. They can be seen and controlled unless they're small. If they're small, fine. They do something wrong, nodes will self-police. If a 1% node tries to breach the rules, a couple 30% nodes are not going to lose all their money for a 1%er. They're going to take action. And the same thing applies back in our constitutional systems. So if we then look at somewhere like Germany again, and the Federalist Constitutional Court has been playing a significant role in shaping law. This, for instance, goes into the use of personal data and surveillance in the digital age. A few years ago in 2020, the court struck down parts of a German law permitting mass surveillance of foreign communications. The court ruled that it violated the constitutional rights of privacy. So that decision had significant implications on how governments balance, well, national security and privacy and security as a whole in our interconnected world. Now, if there is a right for privacy, we have created that in the Constitution, then that is for us to make sure that it is protected. That doesn't mean that we can't have, well, security in place, but there has to be a balance. Just because you have, well, problems in the world doesn't mean you crush your own citizens to do it. And we have to ensure that we stand up for those rights. For instance, we go back to World War II in America, the internment of Japanese citizens. Well, if we think about some of the problems that we've done, we need to make sure that these don't happen again. So the judiciary is also becoming more and more involved in international law. Courts face cases involving international human rights, climate obligations, cross-border corporate accountability in areas where traditional legislative processes have faltered due to political complexity. And this is only going to become more and more complex over time. So if we think about it for a moment, my question now is, why do you think Bitcoin and blockchain in general is going to make the judiciary's role in international law more complex? Anyone want to take that one? No?
I will.
Please.
I've always kind of thought it would eventually make things a bit more simpler rather than more complex. But if I was going to say it would make things more complicated, I would say because it's bringing a new level of education and knowledge that people need to get educated into how to use. So rather than like we have the pre-digital era, then digital era, and now we're advancing into the digital / blockchain era. So you've got a generation of people who need to learn the technology and how to apply it. But I still do think that once they've learned how to apply the technology correctly, and then it will be more efficient and, like you said, simple yet complex. So at first it seems complex, but then once it's learned, then it will seem more simple.
I agree.
Oh, Nathan has a hand up. If Nathan,
Please.
do you want to
I thought
unmute
that it
yourself?
might be something to do with the fact that the miners have a physical location, and depending on where the miners are located, it can if they're, let's say, in a sanctioned country, or a recently sanctioned
Hmm.
country, and then the next day you have to record data on them. I think it would be more complicated if they're limited that way to their physical country that they're in. There's a problem like that, diplomatically or otherwise.
Well, even more than that, miners and pools are more likely to be multinational now. If we think as a miner, a node as a pool, where are the members of that pool? Are they in China? Are they in North Korea? Are they in the UK, America, Russia? So what happens if a pool breaches those terms? If they're an American corporation, then they have to take certain actions. But what if they're dealing with American corporations? So there's complexity in this. The cross-border jurisdictional issues become one of the main challenges. So we look the borderless nature of Bitcoin. Uh, it's there, but the judiciary must handle cases involving cross-border transactions. The laws of multiple countries potentially apply. Courts are tasked with determining which jurisdictional laws govern the disputes. If parties are in different areas and Bitcoin transactions have been settled, a complex matter can evolve because there can be a conflict of law. What if Alice is transacting with Bob and they're going through an exchange, or a wallet or a software, and there's a malfunction in something? And Alice is in the UK and Bob is in Singapore and the other entity is in, say, China or the USA. So this is where the complexities come into it. And of course, we can contract some of these things right from the beginning. But that means forethought. We need to start thinking about how we do this, whether we build in arbitration rights, contracting rights, etc., whether we have a court set up as the one that will be used. I mean, even now, funny as it might seem, there are many Russian disputes happen in Britain. I mean, supposedly there are embargoes, but there are Russian companies still settle, well, international contractual problems in British courts. As ironic as that seems with the embargoes, well, that's something that I don't think they're going to get rid of because it brings money into the British legal system and it keeps a lot of people happy. Well, at least lawyers. So the enforcement of international regulations, international bodies and nation states work on regulations to control these different things, whether it's digital assets, that means anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism funding, know your customer, know your transaction. The judiciary is critical in enforcing regulation, interpreting international treaties, and ensuring that governments and financial institutions comply with global standards. Excuse me. On top of that, we have intellectual property law, contract law, and these will vary. So has anyone ever had to buy things from overseas? I'm sure you've had to do transactions just normally through overseas Amazon or something like this. What happens if you have a dispute? Goes back into interesting scenarios.
Normally, you'd have a contract with the platform, and they would say we are bound under this country, whatever country, and but then that's assuming there's a contract already set out. If there's no contract already set out and you're just transacting with people with Bitcoin, and then it would be messy.
Well, technically, you have a contract when you're negotiating with other people. That itself forms a contract. It doesn't need to be written. So, I mean, there might be law of frauds for sort of limitations on what you can do and what needs to be in writing. But parole contracts by voice, well, they've gone away in the age of email, the age of web contracts, etc. So they're technically in writing, even though they're digital and electronic. Now, when you think about that for a moment, if you don't plan ahead, then we're creating an area for problems. And this is where the judiciary are going to have to start thinking about these things. Asset recovery and fraud, pseudonymous nature of Bitcoin. People are trying to make it more anonymous. But even as a pseudonymous system, it raises unique legal challenges with fraud or theft. Courts must address how to trace assets across borders. What legal frameworks, how do people apply? If there's privacy legislation, like I discussed in Germany, how does that now apply to transactions, and how do we enforce the recovery of stolen funds? Judicial cooperation across different countries becomes essential, and international legal frameworks are increasingly needed for these. That goes into the law of tracing and following. So in Bitcoin, of course, when it stays on chain and you can follow it, then that's following. But once it goes into different assets, goes into an exchange, gets mixed into other currencies, goes back and forwards to Tether, to US dollars, to Tether again, or something like this, then you have to go into tracing. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. The law of tracing follows assets through movement of all different types of goods already. So the irony here that I'm talking about is we already have a legal framework that allows this to occur. Data privacy and security. Again, the example I gave with the German sort of federal legislation being knocked down is an example. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR in Europe, also still the privacy legislation in Britain. These are required to be implemented in a way that handles disputes with personal data, and that's going to be difficult. Taxation and legal recognition. Like it or not, tax is something we have to live with. All of us would prefer to have lower tax rates, I'm sure. Very few people jump up and down and go, please tax me more. But then where do you tax? So as money comes in and out of countries across borders, where does that occur? So what is it? What are we taxing? Where are we putting it? VAT, GST, different jurisdictions have different approaches, and how we actually manage tax is going to be a difficult issue in a distributed interglobal sort of system. Disputes over governance, again, tying this back in. So judiciary's role in mediating governance conflicts in decentralized systems is going to be a frontier in international law. It's going to change things drastically. So what I've been talking about here covers everything. It covers the basis of our foundations of society. So separation of powers, the aspect I covered right at the beginning, articulated by Montesquieu, remains the foundational principle of our democratic governance. The judiciary here plays a pivotal role in this. It is their role to structure and balance, and through a combination where neither judicial interpretation or determination are too strong. We need to ensure that laws are applied fairly, rights are protected, and government power is kept in check. So the conflict between branches of government, of the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, is going to be inevitable. The mechanisms, including judicial review, dialogue, and checks and balances that we discussed, well, these ensure that conflicts can be resolved, but within a constitutional framework. The judiciary is a critical component of this. It's part of modern governance, and it is required if we are to navigate what is effectively a balance between the rule of law and adapting to a changing society. Like it or not, society will change. The point even of things like conservative parties, etc., is not to stop change, but rather to balance it. Every single thing that comes through shouldn't be enacted as a law. Every idea shouldn't be tested. We can think about them, we can debate them. And that's really what this comes about. The separation of powers is really creating something that limits and balances all these different aspects of society in a way, well, that keeps us, well, able to transact, to have an individual sort of life that doesn't impinge on others, and develop as people to, well, hopefully not become parasitically joined to the state, but become independent, truly wealthy, and not just money. By wealth here, I'm also talking about ourselves, our knowledge, our growth as people. That's what it's about. So when we're talking about these areas, the role of the judiciary and the legislative processes are incredibly critical. So who wants to sum up what I've said at this part before I go on to my next bit? What do you think the core of this really is?
A way to encourage everyone to be more active in society is, if you want to see changes in the society, be more active, or be the change that you want to see in the world, as Gandhi would say.
Don't complain about something unless you're willing to do something. I mean, it should be nice and simple.
I'm going to add in that the core of this has been the separation of powers, but also having a method for resolving conflicts between the separation of powers, because conflicts are inevitable between the different powers. But as long as there are methods to resolve the conflicts, and then it's okay, but there are conflicts because they are inevitable. Because as you were just saying, not every law written up by the legislative should be enacted. And also the judiciary often overreach their powers with interpreting laws from the executive. And the
I don't know if I'd say
executive,
often, but they can. And it's important that we balance that, just to interrupt, but keep going, sorry.
And the executive can sometimes overreach the legislature to basically write up their own things as well and push their own agenda as well. And that in some cases there are overlaps with three different powers, but they are designed to balance each other rather than destroy each other. They're meant to balance and create something forward. I wanted to ask a question on this point because something came up on Twitter a few days ago about that. At the moment, we exist in a representative democracy, which I think can it be said that is our legislative branch is built up of representative democracy. And this person suggested about a direct democracy, which I have arguments against a direct democracy because education is key. And if you have the mob, just for the viewers, direct democracy is where everyone has a vote on something. So in this scenario, it would be everyone has a say on a piece of law being put forward. But then my personal argument against it is that if education isn't there, then it can be mob mentality, and it's quite prone to propaganda. Whereas representative democracy, you can have individuals who are actually educated on the topic at hand before they bring it to the executive branch. But on the pro side of it is that if there was an educational system which actually was working better than what we currently have, no offense to the current education system, I just think there are parts which can be better. And the masses were more educated on topics, and then direct democracy where people had individual votes. And I'm just going to throw in as well that before blockchain technology, I don't think direct democracy could work at all because the technology wasn't there. But with direct democracy, it is potential to have the technology there where individuals can actually cast a vote and you can be more certain that it's secure and they are individuals and just not one person doing 1,000 votes. With the technology, it makes it possible if they are educated. My question to you is, on the assumption that people are actually educated on a topic and the technology is built up and ready, is direct democracy better than representative democracy?
I'm going to ask you a question and then I'm going to give you an answer. My first question is, if you have a brain tumor, do you go to a plumber?
No.
Why?
Because a plumber doesn't have the expertise to operate and to treat me.
Would you go to your GP?
Yes, possibly.
To have an operation for a brain tumor?
No, not for an operation. No, I'd go to a surgeon. But I would go to a GP
specialist.
for an analysis. A specialist, yes.
So in a representative democracy, and I'm going to talk ideal, not reality, because, well, unfortunately, what we get can be different. Elective governance, officials govern on behalf of the people. They're meant to be doing that on the collective will. The ideas are that they possess knowledge and skills necessary to be statesmen, to navigate complex societal and economic issues, and understand that the majority selects individuals presumed to be a specialist in governance. So the concept here is specialization. So the importance of individual achievement, reason, and merit should be taken in how we take and apply who we choose, who we vote for. In representative democracy, we should have elected officials like entrepreneurs and innovators, and they should be judged and chosen for their competence and rationality, not their demagoguery. We should avoid mediocrity of the collective. So that's one area we should go away from. So meritocracy resonates with the idea of specialization, and leaders should not simply represent the popular, but be rational experts who lead based on objective principles. And for us to have that sort of choice means we need an educated populace. We don't need just people who are instructed and technically educated, trained. We need people who are truly educated. So we see the downfall of democracy when emotional appeals or sentiment override the rights and expertise of individuals. So where we have the optional here, rationality and experience, and the pursuit of objective truth should weigh high. We should have someone who will stand up even against his voters for principles, and people should know what that person's principles are. So Adam Smith, of course, talked about specialization. Smith said dividing work into specialized tasks, and government is one of these. So in a representative democracy, we need to have specialization where individuals can have different areas of knowledge and they can increase their role and be efficient and have their expertise optimize decision making in a way that maximizes societal wealth and the welfare of us all, not in a welfare state, but our welfare generally. So this concept of what representative democracy should be is a system built on specialization. And for that, we need education. We need people to understand the distinction between someone who is just a good demagogue and someone who can actually, well, have principles and virtue. So at that, before we close, I'm going to go over the next parts. We're going to go into the risks of judicial supremacy. We're going to explore this, focusing on the dangers that oppose when judges take on a quasi-legislative role. I've hinted at this already, but when judges determine laws rather than interpreting them, the idea of judicial supremacy challenges the democratic governance because judges are not elective representatives. They lack direct accountability to the electorate. So this undermines democratic legitimacy. this principle that laws should be created through democratic processes by elected officials who represent the will of the people. When judges bypass a process, they concentrate the lawmaking power in their hands. It's a gap in accountability. It's a gap in transparency. And a key risk is judicial supremacy will stifle democratic deliberation. The legislative process will be, well, overridden, and public debate and compromise won't happen. It'll be curtailed. Judges assuming a law-making role leads to a lack of transparency as well. Judicial decisions in this form lead to laws disconnected from the public will. And while these individuals might think that they're doing good, the potential here for judicial activism where judges advance specific ideological agendas politicizes the judiciary, and the result is eroding public trust and the impartiality of the system. So legal positivism and natural law both provide critiques of judicial supremacy. We've covered a little bit of those in previous lectures. Positivists arguing that judges should apply the law as it's written without inserting values, and natural law theory contending that judges should hold higher moral principles. These can conflict as well. So natural law theorists warn against concentrating too much power on judges, however, because it creates moral authoritarianism. We see that in a lot of areas like Taliban, for instance. So what we'll cover next week is looking at the role of elected representatives versus appointed judges in maintaining the legitimacy of a democratic system. Elected officials being accountable for people through elections, judges being insulated from pressures like that, which means they don't need to think about the controls. Well, that is necessary for some of their roles. Extending their role into the legislative will lead to judicial supremacy. And the only way to stop this is to ensure educated populace, clearer legislative drafting, stronger legislative oversight, and ensuring judicial accountability. So that's next week. At that, do I have other questions?
I have one question. You drew
Yes.
some parallel earlier between these three branches of power and the way the Bitcoin ecosystem works. Is it fair to say that miners would be like the executive branch enforcing rules? But then I would I would ask, is there a legislative branch in Bitcoin, or because since the protocol is supposed to be set in stone, that would be considered as a constitution? How do you see that?
Again, I see it really coming down to the judiciary, the legislature in different countries, and international law. The complexity here, of course, is international law. If, for instance, the control of the system moved to somewhere like North Korea, and the nodes were really being primarily run out of North Korea, then that would be an issue. But it's not. We see miners in a variety of different nations, which itself balances things. So it comes down to a need to balance conflict. If we have a group of miners in China and a group of miners in the United States, as we actually do, and then a few in Europe, then this is going to mean that neither of those sort of groups, these political areas, can take control. Itself balances because we have the Chinese government able to monitor some of it, the American government, but no one with complete power. If they want to do something, they need to negotiate. And this is really the heart of it. We can't, it's not going to work on a gun. It's not a system where you can go and invade the other country and force someone to do something Bitcoin-wise. It doesn't work that way. Rather, it's a system where you have to start negotiating the same way business people do. And you might not always like the result, but that's how it works.
Okay, that's very interesting. So that would mean if I want to be a good Bitcoin citizen, I do have an incentive to at some point make sure there are some nodes running in Europe, for example. I'm a European legislation, so that our voice is also heard in the worldwide economic system of Bitcoin.
Definitely. There are many areas where power is cheap and effective within Europe. There are extra sort of Europe-like places like Iceland that could also be involved. Geothermal energy is still used in Bitcoin mining and other things like that. There are sort of concentration points where transactions are sent. So if you think about the way that the Atlantic transatlantic cables are distributed, there are only a limited number of cables and places. And although there are now cables laid across from South America to Africa, for instance, the capacity is limited. So it's sometimes actually faster from South America to bounce up to New York, to go across to England or France and bounce back down again. And you can complain that that's not fair, but that's not the point. The reality is that's what it is. And unless someone wants to lay another cable, which won't happen unless a lot of money is spent, then this is going to continue. So going back to that, yes, we should have more people involved. And while it's small like it is, and it still is small, the mining of Bitcoin, etc., might be in the news a bit, and people talk about the amount of energy and things like this, but as a global system, it's very small. If it scales to where I hope it will be, and there are billions of transactions a second and billions of people using this network, then that's going to radically change how all of this works. And I don't want to see everything situated in the United States, or everything in England, or everything in France. It would be great to force people to, well, communicate and interact because of the economics of the underlying system. And the internet, that sort of works, and we still have walled gardens. China isolates. Why do they do that? Because they can. They can build a walled garden. But once we build everything economically, we make those walled gardens too expensive. And it took me a long time to understand that my wanting that, well, other people are going to see that as an affront to their power, their control. So I might want that, and I think that would be a better world, but others won't. And the majority might even want that, but power doesn't. So the more people start doing this and the more we distribute these things, not home nodes, commercial systems, the better it's going to be. Okay, so other questions?
Yes. So it was two questions to do with activism. I tried to put it into one unsuccessfully. Can judicial activism sometimes hide under the guise of purposivism? I don't mean to be cynical about that method, but it feels like it could be because of the amount of openness that purposivism could give.
Yes, of course it can. Again, this is where review is essential. This is the nature of why transparency is so important. By that, I mean things need to be reviewed, people need to understand what's going on, and too often people don't. The legal system, the processes are complex. And if people don't take the time to understand and spend their life reading about what the Kardashians or something have done this weekend, rather than building a strong society, we will build demagogues. And we will build people who abuse powers, thinking that they're doing it in the interest of other people.
Yeah.
Going to move over to Christopher quickly, unless you had something to add, Nathan.
I had a curious question about the word activist. So the word activist generally today, you tell somebody, they think of the purple-haired climate people, and the thing is I thought there's a lot of commonality, which is kind of like forcing a policy on people, where the judges will like they'll coerce a certain policy, and these activists also, they try to do it with force. I found it interesting that the word activist is connected to both these types of people.
Yes. In a way, it's both the same.
That's all, just an observation.
So anything else?
Something you mentioned earlier, that it's kind of incumbent on the general citizenry to hold the government and our legal system to account for what they're doing. But I'm a big fan of Aldous Huxley. He kind of warned that like Taylorism, the scientific management over the public, would kind of create this risk where people lost the ability to do that, because I mean, people like Edward Bernays, people who have studied psychology and how to manipulate the masses, advance so far ahead of where the general public is that we kind of lose the ability to hold the power structure accountable, because they're kind of manipulating the general population to prevent that sort of check from being held against them. Do you kind of see that as something that is a risk there?
Going into Huxley, if we think about Soma and various technologies discussed by Aldous Huxley, we see that in social media right now.
Yeah.
The short clips of nothingness, all of the rest, meaningless stuff, the education platforms. They don't make us smarter. They don't engage us. They take away our ability to take in real information. So, but we're allowing it, and we do it to ourselves. So we need to start thinking about this and how we react to all of that. And the reality is, again, it comes back to education. We keep thinking that educating our kids is jumping on the bandwagon of whatever the latest technology is, and we must teach them that, forgetting that by the time they've had 20 years education, that technology is no longer, I mean, for instance, back when I was in school, people started trying to push teaching basic, not visual basic, basic. Yet that's useless now. I mean, great. I mean, it was stupid back then and it's stupider now. And other things like that are there with these technologies that are knee-jerk reactions going, oh, this is a job now. We need our kids to jump on the bandwagon. Well, no, that's training. Have responsibility for both. Educate and understand the society we want to live in, because if we don't, someone's going to do it for us. And that was part of the problem with Taylorism, etc. With all this, someone's going to jump in and do it for us.
Yeah.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, I guess Bitcoin. I guess I'll just add this point in. I think the blockchain technology is kind of a way that maybe we could get ahead of that. Like just having systems where there's more transparency. So like the algorithmic manipulation of social media sites could be brought forward so that people actually see how these algorithms work. I mean, a blockchain.
More than that, so I remember Google and Alta Vista and everything back in the early days of the internet. It used to be that you searched for web pages and you got web pages. Quite often now I do a Google search and my first page is sponsored.
Yeah, I have the same problem. I can't find articles and scientific papers that I used to be able to find very easily through Google.
It used to be with Google that you could use regex and I could make a very tailored response that would get me the page I want anywhere on the internet, and only that page. But that's all been removed. Google disabled that. Why? Because, well, if you get the exact page you want, then you don't have the sponsorship. But that disappears with micropayments. If we focus on what we're delivering to people, then, well, Google could actually go back to being a system that sells something people want as a service, that it has to compete. But of course, businesses don't want to have to compete. I know that's what the irony people don't get in capitalism. Businesses don't want to be capitalist. Businesses want to be capitalist until they're big enough. Then they want to be mercantilist monopolies and control everything. They will say, we need it to be fair when they're small. As soon as they're large, they won't be. They will sit there and go, we need protection so that we're too big to fail. And again, we need a system that makes them compete. And micropayments will make Facebook and Google compete. It can move them away from advertising. And none of them are going to like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
And I think with that, unless anyone has anything else to add, no. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Craig.
All right.
Everyone,
See you next
thanks.
time. Okay. Catch you later.